Okay, so we see people coming into today's webinar. Welcome, everyone. Appreciate you guys spending an hour with us today as we do today's webinar. Just to make sure everybody knows that they're in the webinar, that they think they're in the webinar. This is not a webinar on how to change oil in your car. This is a webinar on how states treat kids in the juvenile justice system. So we really do appreciate you guys coming to this JDAIconnect event. We're excited to hear from our speakers who you see on the screen, all smiling, just as excited as they're as excited to be here as you guys are to attend this. So thanks again for coming. We're going to get started here in just about 10 seconds. This will be recorded. It's going to be on JDAIconnect. And now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, James, who is going to make this the most fascinating hour of your day. James, all you.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you to the JDAIconnect community and the Annie Casey Foundation for giving us this platform to really have this powerful conversation with you all about our recently released report, and with two of our board members and legislators who have championed these reforms over the years to really elevate the standings of their own respective states. My name is James Dold. I'm the CEO and founder of Human Rights for Kids. And before we get started with the initial presentation, I would like our two panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves to you all as well. And we can start with who's on top of my screen right now, which is John.
Thanks, James. And thank you, everyone, for tuning into this. It's been a while since I led was a participant in a webinar like this. Anyway, my name is John Elam, and I'm a lawyer in West Virginia, where I've lived all my life. And I formerly had the privilege to serve in our legislature, the House of Delegates, from 2001 through 2014, 7 terms. And I, at one point, was minority chair of House Judiciary. And during my legislative career, I got to work with James on a number of items, and culminating in some legislation prohibiting the imposition of life without parole sentences on youthful offenders. West Virginia was actually, as we'll discuss later, one of the leaders in that area. And in addition to that, I am serving on the board of directors. I was a founding member of the board of directors of Human Rights for Kids, and I'm a vice president of the organization. And it's a very active board and been a lot of fun.
Thanks, John. Greg?
Yeah, my name is Greg Letting. I'm a state senator in Arkansas. My district includes the city of Fayetteville, so go Razorbacks. I was elected to the legislature first in 2010 and spent 4 terms in the House before moving to the Senate in 2018. So I'm in the middle of my first term there. I served as House Minority Leader in 2013, the only point in state history where the two parties were largely balanced. So that was an interesting session and a productive session. It's also the first session where I really got to work with James. We pulled together a bipartisan group of lawmakers to pass some good anti-human trafficking legislation here. And from that foundation, I ran into him at a national conference of state legislatures event in Minneapolis in 2014. He was then working for the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth and asked if I wanted to help end juvenile life without parole in Arkansas. So that's how he fully got me into criminal justice reform efforts. And have enjoyed every minute. It is some of the most important work and most rewarding work that I've done in the legislature, and have been proud to be part of it. Also a founding member of the Human Rights for Kids board. And it has been unbelievable. I've been on a few boards before, but I've never been on one from its inception. And so watching all the work that James has done to get this organization up and running, it's been really rewarding to be a part of that experience, and I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you both so much. I really appreciate that. And it's an honor to work with you. And we're going to come back to you both here in a few minutes after we do a brief overview of our recently released report. And so now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, hopefully, and not mess anything up. And I think we're now in the shared mode. Let's see here. All right. All right, and my screen is sharing. And all right, there we go. And you just heard from all of us. James Dold again, CEO and founder of Human Rights for Kids. A little bit of background about our organization. You heard from John and Greg, our founding board members, but we are a nonprofit that is dedicated to the promotion and protection of the human rights of children. We do this work through a variety of different lenses, primarily through research, public education, grassroots organizing, as well as policy advocacy and strategic litigation. A little bit about our story. This is sort of a tongue-in-cheek response, which is, a West Virginia Republican, an Arkansas Democrat, and a human rights lawyer walk into a bar. And, it's emblematic of how we came to be in the beginning of our story, which is there were all of these issues that I had started to work on as a young lawyer coming out of law school, that I began to sort of piece together and connect these dots that there was this really group of this vulnerable group of children that existed in the United States. They were kids who were victims of crimes. They were kids who were involved in the justice system. And the one common thread that ran throughout their lives was their exposure to adverse childhood experiences and early childhood trauma that was negatively impacting their long-term life prospects, and that there wasn't anybody sort of holistically talking about what was happening in these children's lives. And so the same kids that were oftentimes being talked about when they were falling behind in the education sector, when they were becoming justice system involved, when they were involved in the child welfare system, were oftentimes the same kids. And so there was a great overlap that existed. And so over the years, I had the privilege of working with Democrats and Republicans from all over the country. And I thought, wow, what if we pull together these incredible people, these Republicans and Democrats who had worked in these bipartisan ways on these really important human rights issues impacting kids, and created an organization focused solely on creating solutions to some of the most pressing issues that we're facing our kids. And that's actually what happened in 2017. And currently we have 6 Republicans and 5 Democrats from all across the country, obviously with Greg and John, West Virginia and Arkansas, but we also have folks from Utah, Nevada, Vermont, Hawaii, really an eclectic group of folks who work together in a bipartisan fashion to fight on behalf of vulnerable kids in the justice system. As I mentioned, we see things a little bit differently. Our work really comes through a trauma-informed human rights lens. And especially when we're talking about kids in the justice system, and one of the reasons that we wanted to prioritize this group of young people was that when we began to step back and peel back the layers of how and why kids end up in the justice system to begin with, there are these common themes that emerge. And this is something that's probably very familiar to a lot of folks on this webinar, right? Which is the fact that a lot of these kids have unmitigated and unaddressed early childhood traumas and adverse childhood experiences that they've been exposed to, which largely contribute to their justice system involvement. In fact, there have been a number of studies that have showed over the years that roughly 90% of all children in the juvenile justice system have experienced at least 2 ACEs. There was another study from OJJDP where they looked at kids specifically in detention centers, where they had found that they had exposure to at least 6 or more traumatic events, with the most common being experiencing violence in their communities. And so what we were really sort of grappling with and looking at were kids who were sort of these vulnerable, or parts of these vulnerable communities, who were kids on the margins, who had this incredible exposure to traumatic events that nobody really thought about or addressed in a holistic way. And then when they went out and they engaged in delinquent or criminal conduct, these issues largely went ignored. And so for us, this was something that we really wanted to focus on as part of what informed our work for criminal justice reform. The second part of the equation for us was looking at human rights standards, particularly those that have been embraced and universally recognized the world over. In particular, a lot of our work is informed by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There are a number of articles in each of those documents that specify how kids should be treated when they come into conflict with the law. And I'm not going to go through each of these. They're on the PowerPoint, and folks will have access to that. But just to use 2 brief examples. Article 37 is a provision that, prohibits the use of torture or other cruel and inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment, such as the use of solitary confinement, for example, on children, as well as the use of capital punishment or life without parole sentences for children. And then the ICCPR specifically spells out that accused juveniles are supposed to be separated and treated differently from adult offenders when they come into conflict with the law. And so these were, organizing documents that we really wanted to center a lot of our work around. So as we get started here and sort of giving us a little bit of a grounding for our report, we're going to have a poll question that Beth is going to go ahead and pull up and ask participants. I'll go ahead and read it out loud. Are there widespread government-sanctioned human rights violations happening against children in the U.S. criminal justice system? Yes or no? We'll give folks a couple of minutes or a minute or so to respond to this question.
James, you're not even going to need a couple minutes. This is a very Zoom savvy audience. They are just clicking away. So now, of course, once I said that, it slowed down a tad. But we're up to 70% of the participants in the webinar have responded thus far. So you just let me know we're up to 75, 76%. So you just give me the nudge and I'll share the results with you.
Okay, we'll give folks another 10 seconds to vote. Hopefully get 100% participation. We'll give folks just a few more seconds.
I appreciate that bipartisan optimism.
All right, Beth, let's go ahead and see these results.
We're at 77%. So we've got a couple more of these polls. So we will hope to do better than 77% next time. There's your results, James.
Great. And so what we're seeing here, and I think folks can see this, but 87% of you said yes, there are widespread government-sanctioned human rights violations happening against children in the U.S. criminal justice system, and about 13% said no. So I'm gonna keep that in the back of your minds, 87%, 13% on this question of government-sanctioned human rights violations that are happening in the U.S. justice system. So in 2018, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights released a pretty scathing report against the United States for its treatment of children in the adult criminal justice system. One of the concluding statements of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights was, and I'm going to read this out loud for folks, as concluded by the Human Rights Committee in its observation on the United States' compliance with this treaty, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the United States does not limit its treatment of children as adults to exceptional circumstances. The Commission observes that the ambiguity of this reservation has been converted into an expansive gap in juvenile justice systems across the U.S., resulting in the violation of children's human rights on federal, state, and local levels. So, in fact, as observed by international human rights bodies, there is this widespread and rampant violation of the human rights of children happening in the U.S. criminal justice system. One of the organizing principles for us in wanting to begin to look at these issues was to try to identify what these gaps were, where state statutes were really sort of falling short of these human rights principles, and looking at everything else that we know about children in terms of their development, both from a juvenile brain and behavioral scientific standpoint, as well as the trauma that we talked a little bit early on about, and sort of how that corresponds to kids' involvement in the justice system. So looking at the trauma lens, the juvenile brain and behavioral development lens, as well as this human rights lens, to try to inform the policy conversation in the United States about how we could do a better job of aligning our laws with our values as Americans, but also these broader international human rights principles, which are also, we would contend, fundamentally American principles as well. So earlier this year, we published what we term our model law. It was a document entitled "The Fight for Our Soul, a legislative blueprint for changing the way the criminal justice system treats children." Within this model law, there are 14 provisions that have actual model language with them that relates to these different categories of law, looking at kids who sort of begin to enter the justice system, as well as how kids are sentenced if they are subject to transfer in adult court. And the purpose behind this model law was really to sort of create a blueprint for policymakers and advocates for what we could do to better align our laws with these human rights principles. And it was really a nonpartisan challenge to the nation to do better by our most vulnerable children. John Elam, who you heard from a little bit earlier ago, authored a very compelling letter with another one of our board members, now retired Republican State Senator A.J. Griffin from the great state of Oklahoma, where they really encouraged policymakers to adopt the provisions that were found in our model law as a way to better align our laws again with these broader human rights principles. But against that backdrop, one of the things that we wanted to do, looking after the publication of this model law, was to do a wide-scale national assessment to see how well or how poorly states were actually doing at complying with many of the provisions that we were highlighting. So our 2020 National State Ratings Report really examines the presence or absence of these 12 categories of law that we have deemed that are essential to establishing a legal framework to protect the human rights of kids in the justice system. Again, these categories are informed by both the CRC and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and they cover essentially four main areas: children's entrance into the juvenile and criminal justice systems, their treatment of children as adults, conditions of confinement, and finally, release and social reintegration of child offenders. States, based on these categories, receive a composite cumulative score. So for each category, a state could receive sometimes half a point, sometimes 1 point if they got full credit for a category. And then based on the totality of the points that they receive a composite score that then determines whether, which tier they fall into, whether they fall into our tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or tier 4, which we then use to sort of color code and rate states, and which we'll talk a little bit about later on. I do want to mention, the broader purpose of this report was really to help educate the advocacy community, public policy makers, and the general public about how the United States and each individual states were doing compared to one another in protecting the human rights of kids in the justice system. Now, there are specific limitations to this report. I should also note at the outset. Two of the most glaring ones are the fact that they are really sort of limited in scope to just statutory protections that are in place. So, for example, some states might have a state Supreme Court decision that came down and said that you cannot impose life without parole sentences for kids. But if a state did not codify that decision, the state wouldn't have received credit. So, whether we're looking at decisions by state courts or regulatory action that might be taken by a specific administrative agency, states still would not have received credit for that category because it's limited in scope just to the statutory protections that are in place. So that is a limitation of the report that we want to acknowledge, because some people might come back and say, well, our DJJ came up with this regulation and they say that they're not going to place kids in solitary confinement, which is great. But again, this report is looking at making sure policymakers are codifying these rules to protect the human rights of kids in the justice system. So it's a limitation of the report and really sort of an advocacy tool, a broader advocacy tool to help inspire legislative change around the country. So I mentioned the four categories. They break down into these 12 broader categories of laws that we were looking at. And so on the far left-hand column, you'll see due process, minimum court age, maximum court age, kids in adult courts. This is really that first bucket that I mentioned, the entrance of kids into the criminal justice system. The second, the middle column here, really focuses on the treatment of kids in terms of sentencing once they've been transferred into adult court. And here we're looking at, mandatory minimum sentences, whether states have eliminated the felony murder rule for children, banning life and de facto life without parole sentences for kids. And then the last column, the first two categories, relate to conditions of confinement, and this is banning the use of solitary confinement and prohibiting kids from being incarcerated or detained in adult jails or prisons. And then the last two categories in that far right column are ending the application of mandatory post-release supervision and the restoration of voting rights, relating specifically to the successful social reintegration of children once they've been released from incarceration. As I mentioned, based on the composite score that states received, they were placed into one of four rating tiers. Tier 1 obviously being the best, it's color-coded blue. Tier 2, yellow. Tier 3, orange, and the last tier is tier 4, which is red. And then we have sort of a special category of states that received the lowest rating that they possibly could based on their cumulative scores that we'll talk a little bit about in just a second. But here, you know, it really runs the gamut for states that are at the higher end of the spectrum. We categorize or describe these states as being states that have created an impressive legal framework to protect the human rights of children in its justice system and taking its obligation to defend human rights seriously. On the other end of that spectrum, tier 4 states are states that have made little to no effort to protect the human rights of children and are likely in violation of international human rights norms and principles. So we're going to do a fun little poll question again. I'm going to have the voice of God, Beth, come back and put the poll question up. This one states that Illinois, Washington, and New York each received higher ratings for protecting the human rights of kids in the justice system than Arkansas, North Dakota, and West Virginia did. True or false? Again, the question is Illinois, Washington, and New York, which are categorically or would traditionally be defined as more liberal or blue-leaning states, each received higher ratings for protecting the human rights of kids in the justice system than Arkansas, North Dakota, and West Virginia, traditionally red or conservative-leaning states did. True or false? And we'll give folks just a couple of seconds here to respond.
Okay, James, we've got the Zoom savvy audience clicking away. They're going to try to improve their results of 77% last time and are actually at 77%.
Great.
So we are at 78%. So this is the, you know, voice of God. I'm glad that was recorded. And I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. We're at 80%. So that's fantastic. We appreciate everybody participating. I see a couple questions in the chat box about the poll. I'll try to address those once I end this poll and share the results with you, James. Here you go.
Great. All right. So again, this question, about 43% of you said true and 57% of you said false. All right. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next slide and we'll see who was right and who was wrong, just about 50-50. All right, so those of you who guessed false, you would be correct. As you can see here on our chart, the states in red and orange are essentially, you know, one way to look at this, or sort of the bad states, or the states that are doing worse. The states that are yellow or blue are doing much better. But one of the things that I'll note at the top here, or on the far right-hand column, you'll see states that are designated the best human rights protectors, and then on the bottom, the worst human rights offenders. As you'll see, North Dakota and Arkansas were among the best human rights protectors, and West Virginia also received a relatively high score, though it didn't receive a score high enough to be designated into that column. And the worst human rights offenders also include, right down there, you sort of see a traditionally blue state, Maryland, but you also see where Illinois and New York rank, which are in our tier 3 category. And so one of the things that became apparent in the course of our doing this research and looking at these 12 different categories is that it upset the traditional narrative that we hear, or we believe sometimes, about conservative states doing worse on criminal justice reform issues, particularly as it relates to kids, than traditionally blue or more liberal leaning states. And this was a really important finding, as I'll get into a little bit later on, about why that is significant for this work and what it means going forward. So I mentioned a little bit about the good, the bad. Those are the best and the worst human rights protectors or offenders, as the case may be. The ugly here really is that 42 states fell into our tier 3 and tier 4, where they had made minimal to no efforts to protect the human rights of children in the justice system. Some broader trends I just want to go over real quickly. There were a couple of categories that were kind of gimme categories, right? So the first one here was having states extend juvenile court jurisdiction to all children under the age of 18. Every state here basically got a point right off the bat for this, except if you versus Wisconsin or Georgia, which still allows 17-year-olds to be excluded from juvenile court jurisdiction. And so, here, states really, for the most part, got 1 point right off the bat. One of the interesting areas that I wanted to flag for folks was the minimum court age. And this is where we were looking at establishing, and again, this is directly in line with the CRC and international human rights protections for kids, which General Comment 24, for those that are familiar with it from the Committee on the Rights of the Child, spells out and specifies that there should be a minimum age by which children are deemed not capable of infringing the penal law, right? And so here we set a minimum age of 10 because, this was actually the first age that was articulated, one of the first ages that was articulated in a previous comment. And we thought, age 10 is sort of, a bare minimum what we should be expecting states to do in terms of excluding kids from being adjudicated delinquent or being subject to arrest for violations of law or for engaging in, what we would traditionally term delinquency type of behaviors. What's interesting about this category, as folks can see from the map, right, is that traditionally red states are actually doing far better than traditionally blue states. And I'll call your attention to Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And people are always sort of surprised by this, that they have set a minimum age of at least 10 for adjudication of delinquency in juvenile court. And there are no exceptions to this, right? So you can look, for example, out in California, where they do set a minimum age of 12, but there are exceptions for kids who commit homicide offenses, right? So we wanted to create a very clear line that, age was paramount in these sorts of considerations. And if you made exceptions to this, that, when you allow kids to be adjudicated delinquent in those circumstances, that it was a human rights violation. And so, it's just one of the, interesting findings that we found. Another finding that I just want to call folks' attention to was the treatment of kids in adult courts. And so we were trying to draw a line to specify that states really needed to prohibit children under the age of at least 14 from being eligible for prosecution in adult court, and that states, in order to receive full credit, also needed to require a child status hearing to take place for kids between the ages of 14 and 17 before they are allowed to be proceeded against as adults. And so the only state in the country that got full credit for this category, interestingly enough, was the state of Kansas. And then there were a number of states that got partial credit for prohibiting the transfer of kids under the age of 14. And again, I'll call your attention to states like Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana and Alabama and South Carolina, where you see other states like New York and Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine and Washington as not receiving credit. Right. So again, pushes back against the traditional narrative that I think a lot of folks think about when they think about how kids are treated in the court system in states just more generally. And you're better protected against a human rights violation in an Arkansas or Louisiana or Texas than you would be in a New York or a Washington state, for that matter. And again, here, sort of mandatory minimum sentence. I'm going to go through these last ones a little bit later, a little bit quickly, because we're running short on time. But here again, you can see sort of states that have allowed judges to depart from any mandatory minimum sentences. Is one of the least filled in categories that we saw, as well as states that allow children to be incarcerated in adult jails or prisons. Although the JDAIconnect has had a provision in there that is trying to get more kids out of adult jails, there are exceptions to that federal law, and there are lots of exceptions that are included in state laws that try to limit children's exposure to being incarcerated in adult jails or facilities, and there were only a handful of states that really had those sort of protections. And then, of course, voting rights. This was another area that we learned quite a bit about during the course of this research, really looking at states that allowed formerly incarcerated youth at the point that they are released from prison to be allowed to vote or to have their voting rights restored. Rather, there are a number of states that do not allow children to have their voting rights restored. And we also limited this. We did not recognize states that allow broad scale gubernatorial action. So for example, in like Iowa and Virginia, there has to be a governor's action in order to restore voting rights. If that's the case, states did not receive credit for that. And there are some states that, prohibit formerly incarcerated youth with felony convictions from ever voting again. And again, those states did not receive credit. Of course, what does all this mean from a big picture standpoint? What it means is that both liberal and conservative leaning states are both doing well on these issues, and they are both failing. Republicans are leading, Democrats are leading, and they're also both failing. But from a big picture standpoint, what it also tells us is that we can win. The fact that Arkansas and North Dakota are right there with California in enacting some of these policies means that they're bipartisan in nature, and they appeal to a broader sense of our American values, rather than values that might be seen with just one party or another party. And so I think it's really important for folks to keep that in mind in your advocacy work and when you're working on these issues, because you're just as likely to come across to a sympathetic Republican lawmaker as you are to a Democratic lawmaker when you talk about the need to protect the human rights of kids in the justice system. And I'll just sort of close this out before we begin our panel discussion. One of our favorite quotes that we always use, the great Nelson Mandela: "There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children." Our big hope here is that the United States advocates, funders, people all over the map will respond to this report and really resolve to do a better job at creating policies and enacting policies that protect children in the criminal justice system from these human rights violations. We're the only country in the world that has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and one of the reasons why these human rights violations are so pervasive against our children. So we're going to wrap up with one last poll question before we transition into the conversation with our two policymakers. Beth, if you don't mind pulling that poll question back up for folks. And we just want to know, and this was a question that came actually from Greg, do you know who your representatives are in the state legislature? And we'll give folks just a couple of seconds to answer that and respond. And then I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pull John and Greg back into this conversation.
And James, as we're waiting for these poll results, there's some good questions coming in the chat box. So I'm glad that we've reserved some time at the end to take a look at those.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Beth, we can go ahead and close out this question.
Okay, here we go. Here's the results.
Wow, okay. 62% of you do know who your representatives are. 38% of you don't. I'm sure Greg will have some encouraging words for you, but that is really good to know. And I'm going to go ahead and close this out and stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to ask for Greg and John to come back on board if you can a little bit. All right. Thank you both. And so I'm going to just start, you introduced yourself at the very beginning. Can you talk a little bit just about what your experience serving on the Board of Human Rights for Kids has been like, and what your favorite bipartisan project that you've gotten a chance to work on has been? And that can be in the courts or in the state legislature.
I
can start with you.
Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I remember in 2017, after we did successfully pass legislation to end juvenile life without parole here, sitting down with James to lunch, and he pitched the idea of this organization. And I don't think he asked if I would be involved at that point, but at whatever point he did ask, I, of course, said yes. It was a great thing to be a part of. And watching his efforts in the 2019 session, which at least here in Arkansas was the first legislative session we'd had since the organization was up and running, watching the work he did and the success he had, not only here in Arkansas, but in other states, was really gratifying. And knowing that he was doing all of this work while also still doing the fundamental work of getting the organization set up and running. He was wearing a lot of hats, is still wearing a lot of hats. But again, it's just been so impressive to watch, and I've been proud to be a part of it. And my favorite experience so far, at least legislation with human rights for kids, because James and I have worked on a number of other issues, but the bill to restore, did a couple of things, but to restore voting rights for people who were sentenced to prison as minors. That was a bill that it's a long story, but we ended up sitting down before a much more hostile committee than I had expected, with much less preparation than we probably needed. And knowing that at that point in the process, the Prosecuting Attorneys Association was still opposed to us, but we managed to get that bill out of that committee that day. And in terms of bipartisan support, I had to go back and look. There wasn't a Republican co-sponsor, but the votes, it passed out of the Senate, which is overwhelmingly Republican, without a single no vote. Little smaller margin in the House. It only had one vote to spare coming out of there, but still there were plenty of Republicans and Democrats that voted for that legislation, and that was so incredibly rewarding to see. So, John.
Sure. For me, probably the most rewarding thing, and bipartisan also at the same time, has been working on some of the amicus, the friend of the court briefs for the U.S. Supreme Court. I never thought, I've practiced law for 28 years now, and never thought I would be writing briefs before the United States Supreme Court. But part of our work at Human Rights for Kids has been to file friend of the court briefs, and I've been involved in two of them now. One on behalf of the Malvo, if you'll remember him, the DC shooter case, who he went before the Supreme Court because a federal court had found that he should be considered, not guaranteed, but should be considered for life without parole. And the state of Virginia was opposing that. We briefed it all before the Supreme Court in support of his right to at least have a parole hearing. And they never got a decision because, fortunately, I guess that's good though, for Virginia changed their law. And I believe, James, it's after 20 years of your sentence as a juvenile, you have to at least be considered for parole in Virginia. So it kind of mooted that appeal. Another one we're doing that's really interesting to me is Edwards versus Louisiana, and we're waiting on a decision in that case. It follows up on what was called the Ramos case back in the spring of this year, where the Supreme Court focused on two states, Oregon and Louisiana, who had schemes in place where jury verdicts could be rendered in a non-unanimous manner, like 10-2 or so forth. And the Supreme Court found that unconstitutional and held it that violated, the right to trial, the Sixth Amendment. And shortly after that decision came down, they decided to take this case of Edwards, who had already been sentenced to after being convicted of a non-unanimous jury, and went through his complete appeals process, and is now up on what's called habeas corpus review. And now the Supreme Court is faced with the task of whether they're going to apply this new ruling that you have to have a unanimous jury, whether they're going to apply that retroactively to, a whole series of cases in Oregon and Louisiana. And our organization, thanks to James and some interns, did a lot of work in identifying quite a few juveniles who, in years past, I think in some cases, James, correct me if I'm wrong, going back to the 60s or 70s, who were sentenced, convicted, and then sentenced as adults and convicted by non-unanimous juries. So, we're hoping that this decision will be, in Ramos, will now be applied retroactively through this case of Edwards versus Louisiana. And then it's always been the next to last poll talked about some of the state rankings. And, for those of you in that poll who basically voted for West Virginia by voting false, you can collect your prize for James after the webinars. No, I'm kidding. West Virginia, unfortunately, too often is usually last in polls. So it was nice when we came out in 2014 with being one of the first states to eliminate life without parole for juveniles. And, that was really a rewarding time in my career. It was not only the last session. I was a Republican. I was in the minority. I was a minority chairman of House Judiciary Committee. And I worked with my good friend, Barbara Fleischauer, who's still in the legislature. She's a Democrat, was also on the Judiciary Committee. And we together championed the bill to eliminate life without parole, and focused on the Eighth Amendment in particular, and the discussion that came out of the Miller decision, which you may have heard about, and said that this is now no longer constitutional. Kids have to at least be given a chance for redemption. And we focused, of course, on the Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment aspect. That is cruel and unusual punishment given the unique situation of children to sentence them to life without parole. And together we passed it, I think, by 77 out of 100 votes in the House, and I believe 33-1 in the Senate. So it really went through in a big way and was, really gratifying to take the lead on that issue.
Thank you both for that, and congratulations to you both too on just your incredible careers and the work that you've done on behalf of kids. For folks that are listening in, what this really means is, John and Greg really helped to save the lives of people who otherwise would have died in prison, and people in both of their states who were sentenced to die in prison as children have now come home and are leading these really amazing lives. And also want to shout out our good friends at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, where I was working at that time as their advocacy director, and leading that work, and they're doing just really incredible work all over the country. But John and Greg, I want to ask you real quickly. You guys have both talked about working with your colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Obviously, Greg, you're a Democrat. John, you're a Republican. What do you think it is about these issues of youth in the criminal justice system and reforming the way that the justice system treats children that resonates so well with both Republicans and Democrats? In other words, what is it about justice-involved youth that draws out the compassion, the empathy and concern and love for these kids that you've seen in your respective parties, as well as with your colleagues on the other side of the aisle?
John, go first.
Well, I think, many legislators are parents too, and, they're able to hear the personal stories and understand. In West Virginia, when we did our bill eliminating the life without parole, so in our state, juvenile offenders have to be considered for parole after 15 years. They can't have a life sentence. They don't necessarily get parole after 15 years, but they have to at least be considered. We studied and I think took to heart the things that are characteristic of kids that are in the system, that end up in the system. They often come from difficult backgrounds, social economic backgrounds, victims quite often of trauma and abuse in their life, kids who have may be homeless, may have, thanks to the opioid epidemic, may have parents who are not in their lives and are being raised by grandparents. And we incorporated those factors into something that a sentencing court now has to always consider when sentencing youthful offenders. They have to look at about 15 different factors before imposing sentence, and also have a mental health evaluation done. So I think part of the answer to get back to your question is that, it resonates with people when, they understand that children already have a tough enough time, making decisions like an adult, and it just gets complicated when you have all these things going on in the background. And then the other thing that I think also resonated with people is, or with the legislators, was the fact that this whole thing was constitutionally based. Life without parole for juveniles is a violation, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, of the Eighth Amendment right to cruel and unusual punishment. And conservatives, and when we were working on this bill, I mean, conservatives will take, and I think also people that are more progressive they'll both take into account things that are impacted by the Constitution, or that the Constitution impacts. And, you know, a lot of people that serve in the legislature do have respect for constitutional principles and want to learn more about them.
Great, thank you, John. Greg?
I think it's a couple of different things. I think the biggest thing is that criminal justice reform hasn't been nationalized or become polarized the way other issues have. And I think that's for a number of reasons. But we're also talking about children and, you know, fairness, liberties, second chances, grace. And I think those are things that really do speak to the fundamental goodness in everybody. And this isn't an issue that one party or the other has sort of claimed or become more closely associated with, because the work, no matter what state you're in, really does seem to be genuinely bipartisan across the board. And I think that's very important. It does really seem to be one issue where Republicans and Democrats can come together to get some really meaningful things done. And I think that's important, especially, you know, as a Democrat, one of the very few left in the Arkansas legislature. It's exciting for me because not only do I really value this work, but I know it's an opportunity where I will be able to work with the majority and get some very important things done. And I think that keeps a lot of people going. There are, I think, also other approaches to it. I mean, for a lot of people, they see it as the right and moral thing. But there are also people who just look at the criminal justice system and look at the actual financial cost to states, and they're looking at ways that that can be reformed, that can not only help the lives of people, but also help states' bottom lines. And you know, for me, it's the right and moral thing to do. But you know, I really don't care how people come to the issue, whatever is motivating them, as long as they're willing to work together and get things done. That's what's important. And again, you have been involved in some of these issues just about every session that I've been down here, and it's some of the most rewarding work that I've been a part of.
Thank you, Greg. And to follow up on that and to ask a question specifically about the report before we get into questions from the audience, you know, when we issued the report last month was, you know, because I know that you guys were both sort of removed a little bit from that process, but when it came out and you had a chance to take a look at it, was there anything, which by the way is interestingly enough, we have 11 board members who are legislators or former legislators, and not all the states did necessarily as well as your states did. So I got a little bit of flack for that from some of, you know, your fellow board members. But I was wondering, is there anything from the report that kind of jumped out to you guys that you were surprised by? Were you surprised by how well your own states did? You know, what was it? Was there anything that just kind of was like, wow, that's eye-opening?
For me, seeing just how few states were in the top two tiers was kind of eye-opening. I mean, I was, I guess, to a degree surprised to see that Arkansas had done so well, but you know, I'd been a part of that work, so I certainly was hopeful that we would be near the top. And unfortunately, we're near the bottom in a lot of lists like that. But seeing that there were very few other states, and you know, seeing that California, North Dakota, and Arkansas, that's a pretty unique mix of states right there. And so that was very interesting.
John, what about you?
Yeah, I was disappointed on one hand to see so many states in categories 3 and 4. Of course, I was happy that West Virginia was in category 2. And I'm also glad that Greg mentioned earlier the economic or financial aspect of this type of work. You know, we often don't associate money with constitutional values and things like that. But in West Virginia's case, I wasn't surprised to see us in the second category, because we have been doing a lot of criminal and continue to do a lot of criminal justice reform, and economic and fiscal budgetary considerations are behind a lot of that too. because as everyone knows, resources are limited, and it's expensive, and people are and legislators, policymakers are coming to the realization that, you know, there's better options than to spend money on throwing the key and locking people away.
Great, thank you both. And we're going to take a couple of questions from the chat box. I'm going to get through a couple of them just really quickly so I can answer folks' question. The first question was, has the United States signed on to those human rights agreements just discussed? So yes, the United States presidents have signed on to both of those treaties. The ICCPR has been ratified, so we are a party to it. President Clinton, and I believe in 1994 or 5, I'm forgetting the year, did sign the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. However, it's never been ratified. That is a treaty that President Reagan's administration worked on back in the 80s when it was first being promulgated. It was approved by the UN, I believe, in 1989. And so we just have not ever had the Senate ratify that treaty, and we're the only nation state to not ratify that particular treaty. But we are a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. As I mentioned, we've made exceptions to the provisions as it relates to juvenile offenders, and that's sort of how the US has sort of skated by those international obligations. There are reservations that sometimes countries can make. And so we have said that we have limited instances where children can be tried as adults. But of course, what we know is it's not really limited. It's quite pervasive, as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights pointed out, and which is why, you know, we've been flagged as a violator of that specific treaty. And then I'm going to pivot this question to Greg, to you, and to John. Do you think diversion should be a mandatory provision for juvenile courts? This would limit the number of juveniles receiving formal court charges and contact with the court. So do you think diversion should be a mandatory provision for juvenile courts?
You're still in office, Greg. I'll let you go first.
It sounds like something that should be done. I tend to defer to James. He points us in a direction, and I follow.
I think it's an excellent suggestion. Just thinking off the top of my head, diversion would be appropriate in a lot of cases, and I don't do a lot of juvenile law. I don't know to what extent in West Virginia it already exists, but certainly for your drug crimes and other nonviolent crimes, I don't know that as a policy you'd be able to get diversion for every type of offense.
Great. Yeah, and I think, you know, and John, to piggyback off that, I tend to agree. And I think, you know, it always depends on, you know, and this is why we're a big proponent of giving discretion back to judges and, you know, allowing juvenile court and even adult court judges to have as much discretion as possible, because the circumstances that each kid has when they come into contact with the system are so unique. You know, there's going to be instances where diversion is going to be appropriate in juvenile court and should be a primarily utilized, so that, you know, those kids, the focus, you know, becomes on treatment and rehabilitation using community-based resources and not involving kids through the justice system lens, right? And so, so I think it all just kind of depends. You know, I'm a big fan of discretion and empowering judges to make good decisions and training judges on how to best make those decisions. The third question we have here is, yeah, somebody was saying, was I saying earlier that if a 9-year-old kills somebody, that they should not get into trouble? That is not what I'm saying. I just wanted to make that clear. There are levels to, you know, how we hold children accountable, right? And when and whether to what extent they can formulate the mens rea that's required to actually be held criminally culpable. You know, it's our belief for children under the age of 10, they don't have the mental requisite to be able to do that. Now, that doesn't mean that you just let, you know, a 9 or 8 or 7-year-old or 5-year-old, as the case may be, just go free. It means that we have a child welfare response in place. We have a response that examines how and why and under what circumstances this child engaged in that particular conduct and gets them the treatment, services, and help that they need, right? And so I think one of the things that we're trying to envision at Human Rights for Kids is a tiered approach to criminal justice and juvenile justice reform, where when we encounter children who are under a certain age, there's a child welfare response in place. For children who reach a particular requisite age where they can form the mens rea requirement, and up to a certain age, there's a juvenile justice response in place. And then limiting the application of the adult criminal justice system, where you're going to have very severe consequences to children who are under the age of 14. So we're trying to kind of balance as much as we can the responses that are elicited from the child welfare, the juvenile justice, and the adult criminal justice system apparatus to recognize the developmental realities of children, as well as the trauma that they've experienced. And these, aren't necessarily bright lines that we can always draw, but we're trying to, create a system that's more fair, more just, and creates trauma-informed and age-appropriate accountability measures that limits children exposure to harmful effects of the justice system or system involvement more generally. So I'm going to sort of wrap that up there, but I'm also going to pivot and let Greg and John also comment on that, just about, what happens when we have these very young kids, kids under the age of 10, let's just say, who commit, more serious types of offenses. Do you guys have general thoughts on that as well, in terms of, what kind of response, what do we need to be doing from a societal standpoint to help those children?
Well, certainly, at that type of age, that young of an age, where culpability, just as a matter, I think, of common sense, has to be so low. The ability, from a legal standpoint, to, as you say, to form the mens rea. So I think that's a case where it's good probably to have an age limit, and certainly probably a younger age limit, maybe up to 10 to 14, like we list in our report, where somebody cannot be transferred to adult court, but are dealt with in the juvenile system, and then who knows, maybe later on in the mental health system, we call it the hygiene system here, but that their underlying issues are addressed that caused or that are behind committing this crime. I mean, that's the importance we saw in our state overall of having a sentencing judge have the benefit of a report, a comprehensive mental health evaluation.
Oh, you're muted, Greg.
Sorry, I was just trying to minimize feedback. I think that is a misconception that I've run into here, particularly with that bill, was that, does this mean that nobody should be punished? And that's absolutely not the case. We do need to handle crime seriously. And the more serious the crime, the more serious the punishment. But we need to do so in a way that is geared towards restorative justice, as I have come to learn it throughout this process, in a way that doesn't just end up locking people away for the rest of their life, because that does us no good. And so just doing what we can to make sure that these children have the resources they need, that they understand the consequences of their actions, but that we do put them on a path that they can once again become a constructive and productive member of society.
Great. And, and just to follow up that question too with folks, because Greg's from Arkansas. Arkansas is a state that has this provision in place, as is Texas and Alabama and Mississippi, and South Carolina. And so, the lawmakers in those states, I think, thought long and hard about the fact that, when you're talking about an 8-9-year-old child, them not having the requisite ability to form that mens rea requirement, and what kind of response we need to have in place as a result of that. Again, it isn't sort of a conservative principle; it's sort of a fundamental American principle based on our a system of law that we've created over time. And so I think that's another thing that I would just say in response to that. And then this last question here that I'm going to ask you from the audience is, folks are very curious to know what our thoughts are as to why blue states are so much worse on this issue, and what it means for our continued advocacy for these issues under the new administration. Greg, you're a Democrat, so I'm gonna I'm gonna throw it to you and let you field this. Why are Democrats so terrible on this issue?
I really can't say. It may be that just a lack of awareness of what the current laws are, and that people in states that tend to be Democratic, maybe there's just this misconception that, well, we probably do very well on all these issues and nobody's ever taken the time to really look at things. I mean, I'm constantly, I've been in office now for almost 10 years, but I still have people who come up to me and say, did you know that this was the law in Arkansas, that this is the way this works? Sometimes it's just a lack of knowing where we stand. I did not know anything about juvenile life without parole until James came along. And so it could just be, again, in these liberal states, people assume that they're doing well. And so that's why these state rankings are so important, so they can highlight the deficiencies across the country.
Great.
Let me bail out Greg just very quickly, or help Greg real quickly on that. I think when you especially have states where the makeup may be close, more even Democrat and Republican, certainly a minority party, speaking purely politically here, could put, a lot of pressure on the majority party as to, why would you do this? Why would you enact this type of legislation? I'm sure you've run into that, Greg.
From time to time. There's not a lot of pressure that we can put currently on my Republican colleagues. Not quite enough of us, but certainly what I mentioned earlier, that 2013 session was that was right at the peak where things were going from overwhelming Democratic control to overwhelming Republican control. But that session, we were pretty balanced. Republicans had majorities in both chambers, but they were narrow margins. We still had a Democratic governor. It's probably, if not my most favorite session, it was definitely the most productive, where people really came together because we had to. It was the only way we were going to get anything done. And I do think, restoring some kind of balance would be good.
Well, great. And this has been a really wonderful conversation. And I want to, before I give you all the final word and then let the voice of God close this out, I want to just thank everyone for joining us for this presentation. Please go to humanrightsforkids.org. You'll find more information about our report. We'd be happy to serve as a resource and to help folks who are looking to transform their state's juvenile and criminal justice systems on these issues. But John and Greg, before we turn it back to Beth to close this out, I want to give you both the final word, and maybe you can leave our audience with some words of encouragement, especially folks who may be encountering opposition or who may be tired because they've been fighting these battles for so long, to keep going and to fighting the good fight like you all have done. So I'll turn it over to you both to give us the final word here.
Go ahead, Greg.
Well, these fights can be very challenging. I remember 2015, the first time that we tried to end juvenile life without parole here. I was the lead sponsor in the House, working with the Republican senator. It took us several tries to get that bill out of our Judiciary Committee, and we finally got it to the House floor, and it got 29 yes votes. And one of the biggest challenges we had faced was that there was a Republican House member who had lost her daughter to a murder some years before. And the person in that case wasn't a juvenile, but it was still a very challenging issue for her. And she just was immovable on the issue and had a number of people at her back. But 2 years later, we came back. This time, the Republican colleague in the Senate I've been working with, Senator Missy Irvin, she started the bill down there. And to make a very long, powerful story short, we were able to get that representative who had basically single-handedly defeated the bill in the House. We got her on board and got her to not just support the bill, but carry it in the House. And ended up clearing that chamber in 2017 with 86 yes votes. And that was just a 2-year period, but it was such a massive swing. And it was certainly another important lesson for me that you can never discount or write off somebody as being impossible to move on an issue, because through a series of conversations, we were able to get Representative Petty on board. And without her support, that bill would not have passed. And so no matter how difficult and challenging issues might look, know that there's always a way.
Yeah, exactly. I think very well said. And, certainly thank you to everyone who attended this webinar. I mean, I think you're certainly part of the solution, and thank you for the work you do and the advocacy you do or may do here in the future. It's really important. And, I guess to put it in simple terms, if West Virginia could have success in this area, anyone can have success in this area. But, in 2014, when we did life without parole, we were fairly even with the Democrat majority. It switched in 15 to a Republican majority, but they still continue to enact criminal justice reform. So it truly does go across party lines, and there are opportunities there to work in a bipartisan manner. And it's extremely important for stakeholders to have a voice. They can make a difference. When I went to some events for James mentioned the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, among other speakers they had were individuals who had been the victims of juveniles who committed crimes and wanted a more restorative approach to the criminal justice system, and didn't want to see that juvenile's life thrown away. So it's a great area for advocacy. It no doubt can be frustrating at times, but it certainly is needed and is worthwhile.
Great. Thank you both. Beth, we'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Okay, thank you so much. A huge debt of gratitude and a shout out to James, John, and Greg for sharing this work with us for the past hour. Apologize to our participants. We're 3 minutes over, but if you were like me, I could have listened and listened and listened. So thank you each to our panelists. Continue the conversation on JDAIconnect. This recording, the slides will be up on JDAIconnect. If you haven't seen James' blog, check that out also. When you close out, you're going to have a brief survey, 3 minutes at the most, I promise. And that we appreciate your feedback because that's how we, we'll try to bring the content to JDAIconnect. So again, have a great day. Thank you, everybody. And again, thanks, John, Greg, and James.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.